Imagine you've got a mate who's borrowed money from you twice, promising each time that it's definitely the last time, absolutely the final ask, cross their heart and hope to die. Then they show up at your door a third time saying, "I know what you're thinking, but trust me, I've really sorted myself out now, no more borrowing after this." Would you believe them? Of course not. Yet here we are with Chancellor Rachel Reeves standing in the snowy glamour of Davos, Switzerland, telling us that despite £66 billion in tax rises across Labour's first two budgets, Britain is now in a very strong position and definitely, absolutely pinky promise won't need any more tax increases. And we're all supposed to nod along and pretend this isn't exactly what she said before the last tax rise. Quick favor, if you're enjoying this fiscal skepticism, hit that subscribe button and smash the bell icon. Over 94% of you haven't yet. It's completely free, takes 2 seconds, and helps us keep holding politicians to account when they make promises they've already broken twice. Cheers if you did. Now, back to Rachel's latest reassurances. So, let's set the scene properly, because context matters when politicians are making promises about your wallet. Rachel Reeves is speaking to Bloomberg at the World Economic Forum in Davos, that annual gathering of global elites, where the world's most powerful people discuss inequality whilst sipping champagne in a Swiss ski resort. The optics alone are spectacular. Here's the Chancellor, fresh from implementing the largest tax rises since the Second World War, telling international investors and journalists that Britain has done enough on tax and won't need any more increases. She confirmed that no fiscal changes are planned for the spring statement, as if this pronouncement should inspire confidence rather than profound skepticism. Let's do a quick chronological tour of Rachel Reeves's promises on taxation, because this is where it gets properly embarrassing for the government. After Labour's first budget in 2024, Reeves explicitly said no further tax increases would be required. That was the line. "We've done what's necessary, public finances are sorted, no more tax rises needed." That position lasted precisely until November, when the government announced an additional £26 billion of tax measures. £26 billion! That's not a minor adjustment or tweaking around the edges. That's a massive U-turn, delivered with the political equivalent of, "I know we said no more taxes, but we didn't really mean it." Now she's back again, standing in Davos, telling us that this time it's different. This time she really means it. Britain definitely won't need more tax rises because we're in a very strong position. Forgive us, Chancellor, if we're not immediately rushing to believe you, given that your track record on this specific promise is currently 0 for 2. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 3 times, well, that's just British politics, isn't it? Reeves pointed to the Treasury's strengthened fiscal buffer as evidence of stability. She highlighted that in November's budget, she more than doubled the government's headroom against its fiscal rules, increasing the margin for error to £21.7 billion. This, she claims, has given greater confidence to people that we can have stability on a fiscal front. Let's translate that from politician speak into English. The government has given itself more wiggle room in its own self-imposed rules, and we're supposed to believe this means they definitely won't raise taxes again, rather than simply meaning they've given themselves more space to maneuver before they're forced to admit they need more revenue. The Chancellor also name-dropped the International Monetary Fund, claiming they'd identified the UK's programme as the fastest fiscal consolidation among G7 nations. That sounds impressive until you remember that fastest fiscal consolidation is essentially economist jargon for hitting people with tax rises and spending cuts more aggressively than other countries. It's like bragging that you're losing weight faster than your mates because you've adopted a more extreme crash diet. Sure, the numbers might look good short term, but is it sustainable and healthy? That's a rather different question. Reeves used her Davos appearance to announce changes to fiscal oversight arrangements. Under the revised framework, the Office for Budget Responsibility will assess compliance with fiscal rules only once a year at the autumn budget, rather than conducting a second assessment alongside spring forecasts. Let me translate that into plain English. The government has decided that having independent economists check their sums twice a year was a bit inconvenient, so they're cutting it down to once a year. That definitely sounds like something a government confident in its fiscal position would do. Nothing says, "We've got this sorted," quite like reducing the frequency of independent scrutiny. Despite all her emphasis on stability and confidence, Reeves acknowledged the wider global backdrop and admitted the world has become a very uncertain place. She added that she would not write future budgets today. That's politician code for, "I'm making all these promises about no more tax rises, but I'm also leaving myself an escape hatch in case I need to break this promise too." It's the equivalent of saying, "I'm definitely coming to your party," whilst quietly adding, "unless something comes up." The get-out clause is built right into the reassurance. Let's talk about the scale of what Labour has done since taking office, because the numbers are genuinely staggering. Across their first two autumn budgets, they've implemented £66 billion in tax increases. £66 billion! To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire annual budget of the NHS in England, or about £2,400 for every household in Britain. Labour's tax rises have pushed the UK tax burden to the highest level since the Second World War, not since the financial crisis, not since the 1970s, but since 1945. That's the highest tax burden in 80 decades, and Reeves wants us to believe that definitely, absolutely, no more increases will be necessary. The political gymnastics required to maintain this position are genuinely impressive. After the first budget, no more taxes were needed. After the second budget, which included £26 billion more in taxes, still no more taxes will be needed. It's the fiscal equivalent of, "This time I've really quit smoking," from someone lighting their third cigarette of the conversation. The pattern is so clear that even the most optimistic voter might harbour some doubts about the credibility of these promises.
What makes Reeves's position particularly tricky is that she's already had to backtrack on several policies following political pressure. The government amended inheritance tax rules affecting farms after massive protests from the agricultural sector. They adjusted business rate reforms impacting pubs after warnings of mass closures across the hospitality sector. These weren't minor technical changes. These were substantial policy reversals prompted by public outcry and political pressure. If the government's tax plans were so carefully thought through and precisely calibrated, why have they needed to make major adjustments within weeks of announcing them? The farming inheritance tax situation is particularly instructive. The government introduced changes that would have significantly increased tax bills for family farms being passed down through generations. Farmers protested, argued it would destroy family farms and force sales to corporate agricultural businesses. The government initially held firm, insisting the policy was necessary and well-designed. Then, faced with mounting pressure and appalling poll numbers in rural constituencies, they backtracked and introduced amendments. That's not the behavior of a government with a coherent, stable fiscal plan. That's the behavior of a government making it up as they go along and hoping nobody notices. Similarly, the business rates situation for pubs demonstrates the problems with Labour's approach. They announced massive increases, faced warnings of widespread closures and job losses, initially ruled out additional support for most of the hospitality sector, then promised vague future help whilst simultaneously claiming no more fiscal changes were planned. The mixed messaging has been catastrophic for business confidence. Firms need to make investment decisions based on their expected future costs, but the government keeps changing those costs in response to political pressure, making planning essentially impossible.
Reeves's claim that Britain is in a very strong position to absorb future economic shocks is also debatable, to put it mildly. Yes, the government has increased its fiscal headroom against its own rules, but those rules are somewhat arbitrary and have already been changed multiple times. The fundamental question is whether the British economy can sustain this level of taxation without damaging growth, investment, and productivity. There's a growing body of economic opinion suggesting that we've reached or exceeded the point where higher taxes start producing diminishing returns as businesses and individuals change their behavior to avoid or reduce their tax liabilities. The phrase, "we don't plan any tax changes in the spring," is doing an enormous amount of work in Reeves's reassurances. "We don't plan" is very different from "we won't" or "we're ruling out." It means that as of today, in the current fiscal environment, with current economic forecasts, they're not planning tax rises. But if circumstances change, if growth disappoints, if public spending pressures intensify, well, those plans might change. And given that circumstances in politics and economics change constantly, that's not really much of a promise at all. The decision to reduce OBR assessments from twice yearly to once annually is particularly concerning from a transparency and accountability perspective. The OBR was created after the financial crisis precisely to provide independent oversight of government fiscal policy and prevent politicians from making overly optimistic assumptions about revenues and growth. Having them check the numbers twice a year meant the government couldn't stray too far from fiscal reality without it being publicly highlighted. Reducing that to once a year gives the government more room to make questionable assumptions that won't be officially challenged until the autumn budget, by which point policies might already be locked in. Reeves's emphasis on the IMF's endorsement of Britain's fiscal consolidation is also rather selective. Yes, the IMF has acknowledged the UK is implementing fiscal tightening faster than other G7 nations, but the IMF has also expressed concerns about the impact on growth, warned about the challenges facing the UK economy, and noted risks to the fiscal outlook. Cherry-picking the positive bits of an IMF assessment whilst ignoring the warnings and caveats is classic political spin.